Our understanding of the Supreme Court comes from Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution, which is the shortest of the sections on the three main branches of government. The judicial branch's description is so brief that it left a fair bit of wiggle room for future generations to play with in regards to the form and function of the court. The first role of the Supreme Court is obvious, acting as the highest court in the country. This is the court that other courts have to answer to should they step out of bounds. In order to understand this role, we must first understand how the Supreme Court works. The Supreme Court mainly exercises appellate jurisdiction and not original jurisdiction. This means that the cases that they hear come from appeals from lower courts. The Supreme Court does not have the power to set up these lower courts. That power lies with the legislative branch. Ever since the 11th Amendment was put in place, original jurisdiction has been used quite rarely. The Constitution says that the Supreme Court can exercise judicial power on all cases, including cases, quote, between a state and a citizen of another state, end quote. But according to law professors Bradford R. Clark and Vicki C. Jackson, quote, the 11th Amendment's text prohibits the federal court from hearing certain lawsuits against states, end quote, and that, quote, state courts do not have to hear certain suits against the state if those suits are based on federal law, end quote. If the losing party of the case makes an appeal and receives a writ of certiorari, then the case will be sent to the Supreme Court for approval. From October to June, the court takes on cases that make it into their docket. Few cases actually receive the four necessary votes of approval from the Supreme Court judges to actually make it into the court. If four of the judges approve the case, then it will be selected. Now we move on to the second and perhaps most important function of the Supreme Court. When the founders studied Montesquieu's The Spirit of Law, they realized that separating the three branches would allow each branch to have a set of checks and balances on the other branches. The Supreme Court protects the citizens by making sure that actions done by the other two branches are constitutional. This power was cemented after the case of Marbury v. Madison, when the Supreme Court gained the power of judicial review. This power actually doesn't come expressly from the Constitution, but from Federalist No. 78, written by Alexander Hamilton. He says that the court should, quote, protect individual liberties and rights against societal and governmental oppression, end quote. This is why the Supreme Court is not democratically elected. It gives an extra barrier from the majority stepping on the rights of the minority. This leads nicely into their next role, which is that the Supreme Court functions as interpreters of the Constitution. Every politically savvy American believes that they are qualified to interpret the Constitution, but extremely few actually are. This is why we have a group of highly trained individuals that are selected based on merit to perform this role. They rigorously study the Constitution, as well as the rulings and dissenting opinions of all prior Supreme Court cases to get the fullest view possible of how the Constitution was interpreted in the past and how it should be interpreted in the future. They carry this into their judicial review cases, which keep the whole government and its citizens in check based on our Constitution, and they use previous rulings as the basis for the precedent. Though the judicial system is by no means perfect, the Supreme Court remains an essential pillar in the foundation of the American government and displays the brilliance that our founders had when they created the American political system.